What kind of global order emerges when a growing share of the world's oil no longer moves in daylight, but through a shadow system of tankers, shell companies, and silent crossings? In the last few years, sanctions on Russia and Iran did not stop their exports. Instead, they helped create a parallel energy network, shadow fleets at sea, and informal logistics on land. Russian crude rerouted from Europe to Asia, Iranian barrels flowing quietly to China and India, and Gulf producers locking in long-term liquefied gas contracts. Together, they are redrawing the global energy map. This video explains what is really happening and why it matters. For decades, the global oil market followed relatively predictable routes. Russian crude moved into Europe through pipelines and tankers. Middle Eastern barrels traveled through the Suez Canal and around the Cape toward Western markets. Insurance, shipping, and finance were dominated by Western companies under clear rules. Iran was the exception that signaled the future. Under repeated sanctions since the 1980s, Tehran learned how to keep exports moving without attracting full visibility. It relied on older tankers, opaque ownership structures, and ship-to-ship transfers at sea. The goal was simple: move barrels, obscure origin, avoid direct confrontation. When large-scale sanctions hit Russia after the invasion of Ukraine, Moscow did not start from zero. It borrowed heavily from Iranian playbooks and merged them with its own resources. By the end of 2022, hundreds of aging tankers had changed hands, often through complex chains of intermediaries. A second, less transparent shipping universe had begun to form. At the same time, Europe pivoted away from Russian supplies, turning instead to Norwegian pipeline gas and liquefied gas from the United States and Qatar. Asian buyers, especially in China and India, increased purchases of discounted Russian and Iranian crude. The result was not a collapse in flows, but a rerouting of flows, from visible channels into a mix of visible and shadow routes. If strategy and economics shape the world, make sure you're part of the conversation. Subscribe now and stay ahead. The turning point came when the shadow system stopped being marginal and became systemic. By 2024 and 2025, independent research groups and European institutions estimated that Russia's shadow fleet had grown from a few hundred ships at the start of sanctions to well over 1,000 tankers and product carriers. Many of these vessels were at the end of their normal commercial life, bought at a discount and registered under flags of convenience. Analysts tracking tanker movements reported that a large share of Russian seaborne crude in the Baltic and Black Sea was now moved by such vessels, with traffic through key straits increasing sharply compared with the pre-war period. These ships often operated with inconsistent insurance records, opaque ownership, and high technical risk. In parallel, Iran quietly expanded its own shadow fleet. Estimates between 2024 and 2025 suggest that Iranian exports regularly exceeded 1.5 million barrels per day, with some months above 2 million, and around 9 out of 10 barrels heading to China. Many of these cargoes were delivered through ship-to-ship transfers at sea, often into smaller independent refineries along China's coast. At this point, shadow shipping was no longer a side story. It had become one of the main ways in which Russian and Iranian crude reached the market. Sanctions had created not only constraints, but a new logistics ecosystem. To understand how this new ecosystem works, it is useful to look at three interconnected layers: the tankers at sea, the financial and insurance shell around them, and the informal networks on land. First, the tankers at sea. The so-called shadow or dark fleet consists largely of older vessels that have changed ownership and flag, often several times in a short period. Some sail under registries that have expanded rapidly with little oversight. Many operate by turning off standard tracking systems, changing their reported identity, or conducting ship-to-ship transfers away from monitored ports and terminals. Transfer points in open waters, near places such as Laconia in the Mediterranean, off the coasts of North Africa, around parts of the United Arab Emirates, and in Asian anchorages, allow crude to be moved from a sanctioned vessel into another ship that will complete the journey. On paper, the origin becomes harder to trace. In practice, the oil is blended into global flows. Second, the sanctions evasion ecosystem. Shipping alone cannot bypass sanctions. Ownership, insurance, and finance must also be adapted. Complex chains of shell companies spread across jurisdictions such as the Gulf, Hong Kong, small European states, and offshore centers obscure who ultimately controls a vessel. Some ships switch flags, names, and management firms within a short period. Insurers with limited transparency step in where traditional Western insurers have withdrawn, allowing tankers to continue operating even when their status would normally raise concerns. Analysts sometimes distinguish between a dark fleet that deliberately disables tracking and a grey fleet of vessels that operate with partial compliance but still move sanctioned cargo. Both categories help keep oil flowing while regulatory authorities try to catch up. Third, Iran's informal land networks. At sea, Iran's behavior resembles Russia's. On land, it adds another layer. In sanctions-heavy border regions, Iran's informal micro-logistics networks have expanded. These include small-scale traders and mule-based transport across mountainous terrain along the frontiers with neighboring states. Goods, fuel, and components cross in small quantities that are hard to monitor individually, but significant in aggregate. This combination, shadow tankers at sea and informal corridors on land, means that sanctions often redirect trade instead of stopping it. Energy flows become harder to see, not necessarily smaller in volume. Against this background, global energy routes have begun to pivot. Russian crude that once moved primarily into Europe has been redirected toward Asia, especially into India and China. Discounted prices and flexible shipping arrangements have made these barrels attractive despite the complexity. From the perspective of Moscow, sanctions have increased logistics costs, but also deepened dependence on a smaller group of buyers. Europe, meanwhile, has reduced pipeline and seaborne imports of Russian oil and gas and turned to alternative suppliers. Norway has become the main pipeline gas provider, while liquefied gas imports from the United States and Qatar have surged. European utilities have started signing more long-term contracts with Gulf and African suppliers to secure volumes through the late 2020s. Qatar has announced multiple expansions that will raise its liquefied gas capacity well above current levels by the end of the decade, locking in contracts with Asian and European customers for periods of 15 to 20 years. In effect, Doha is hardwiring its role as a core supplier to both East and West. China benefits from the other side of this rotation. By buying discounted Russian and Iranian crude, it reduces its average import cost while diversifying away from more visible Western suppliers. Some analysts describe this as a mixed barrel strategy, blending different origins into a stable refining slate at lower cost. Taken together, these shifts support one central conclusion. The world's energy system is no longer structured around a West-centric flow. It is becoming a network with stronger eastward corridors, more Gulf leverage, and a permanent layer of shadow trade. The rise of shadow shipping and alternative routes carries structural risks that go beyond sanctions enforcement. Maritime safety and environmental risk. Shadow fleets are often older, with unclear maintenance standards and limited oversight. Operating with tracking systems disabled and conducting transfers in open waters increases the risk of collisions, groundings, and spills. A single major incident in a narrow sea lane could disrupt traffic for days or weeks and trigger costly cleanup operations. Financial and legal opacity. Layered ownership structures and opaque insurance create uncertainty about liability. If a tanker from the shadow fleet causes damage in a sensitive area, it may be difficult for affected states to recover costs. This undermines established norms in maritime law. Geopolitical miscalculation risk. As more sanctioned cargo moves under the radar, the line between normal trade and illicit activity becomes blurred. States may respond with stricter patrols, seizures, or even targeted strikes against vessels they see as violating sanctions. The potential for misjudgment rises, especially in congested or contested waters. Long-term system fragmentation. The more the world relies on separate daylight and shadow energy channels, the harder it becomes to manage crises collectively. Trust in shared rules declines when entire segments of trade rely on parallel systems outside standard governance. In the short term, these mechanisms keep oil flowing. In the long term, they embed fragility into the global energy architecture. Before we move forward, make sure you subscribe. Energy flows are shifting. Sanctions are reshaping incentives. The shadow system is growing. The real question is this: when a rising share of the world's oil moves through dark fleets, informal networks, and parallel routes, who truly controls global power? The states that write the rules, or the actors who learn to operate outside the light? If strategy, history, economics, and finance shape the world, this is where they converge. Subscribe now and join the conversation.